A racist pharmacist humiliates a black man because he thinks that the black man's prescription is fake. The pharmacist is hit with karma the next day when he is called into his boss's office. The bell above the pharmacy door chimed softly as Charles Johnson stepped inside. The cool air hit him, a welcome change from the late afternoon heat outside. He glanced around the pharmacy, noticing the familiar sights. Rows of shelves filled with medicine, snacks, and everyday essentials. A few people milled about, browsing the aisles or waiting near the pharmacy counter. Charles slipped his prescription slip into his back pocket and took a deep breath. It was just another errand, something he did every month now. He didn't think much of it. He spotted the line at the counter and walked over, joining the queue behind an elderly woman clutching a bottle of vitamins. He glanced at his phone, scrolling through some emails to pass the time. Every few seconds, he looked up at the counter. Henry, the pharmacist, was busy helping a young mother with two restless kids. Charles had seen Henry many times before, always bustling around behind the counter, filling prescriptions, offering advice, or chatting with the regulars. Henry seemed like a no-nonsense type, the kind of person who followed the rules to the letter. Charles shifted his weight, feeling the slight crinkle of the prescription paper in his pocket. He had been coming to this pharmacy for years, even before he was diagnosed. It was close to his office, convenient. There was a certain comfort in the routine of it all, a sense of normalcy in picking up his medicine and exchanging a few polite words with the staff. "Next, please," Henry called, his voice carrying over the low hum of the store. The young mother thanked Henry and herded her kids toward the exit. Charles watched as Henry turned his attention to the next customer, moving with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for years. The line moved quickly. Soon it was Charles's turn. He stepped up to the counter, offering Henry a friendly nod. "Good afternoon," Charles said, sliding the prescription slip across the counter. Henry glanced at Charles briefly, then took the slip, his eyes shifting to the piece of paper. Charles waited, expecting the usual routine. A quick look, a nod, and then Henry disappearing into the back to fill the prescription. But today, Henry's brows furrowed as he looked at the slip. He held it up closer to his face, squinting at the handwriting. Charles felt a flicker of unease. He tried to brush it off. Maybe Henry was just being thorough. "Is there a problem?" Charles asked, keeping his tone light. Henry didn't answer right away. He continued examining the prescription as if trying to decipher a code. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Where did you get this?" Henry asked, his voice flat. Charles blinked. "From my doctor. Same place I always get it." Henry nodded slowly, still holding the slip. "And who's your doctor, if you don't mind me asking?" Charles's unease grew. This was different from the usual routine. "Dr. Patel," he said. "I've been seeing him for a while now. He's just down the street." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly. He glanced from the prescription to Charles, then back again. "We've had some issues with fake prescriptions recently," Henry said. "Just trying to be careful, you understand." Charles felt his shoulders tense. "I've been coming here for years," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "You've never had a problem with my prescriptions before?" Henry shrugged. "Like I said, just being careful." Charles's unease was turning into something else now, something closer to frustration. He could feel the eyes of the other customers on him, sensing the tension at the counter. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I don't see why there's an issue now," Charles said. "I've always followed the rules. This prescription is from a legitimate doctor. There's nothing wrong with it." Henry met Charles's gaze, his expression still unreadable. He didn't respond immediately, instead placing the prescription slip on the counter. Charles could see the hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that seemed out of place. "Just give me a moment," Henry said finally. "I need to check something." Charles watched as Henry picked up the prescription slip and turned away, heading toward the back of the pharmacy. He felt the frustration building, a familiar knot in his chest tightening. This wasn't right. It was just a routine visit, just another day, and yet something had changed. Charles watched as Henry walked away, disappearing behind the tall shelves stocked with various medications. He could hear the faint rustling of paper and the clicking of a keyboard as Henry did whatever checking he felt necessary. Charles tried to remain calm, but a sense of unease had settled in his gut. This wasn't how things usually went. He had never been questioned like this before. The line at the counter had dissipated. The elderly woman with the vitamins had already left, and the other customers were now keeping a respectful distance, their eyes occasionally flickering toward Charles. He could feel their glances, the silent judgments, or perhaps just curiosity. It made him feel exposed, like he was under a spotlight. A few moments later, Henry returned to the counter, holding the prescription slip in his hand. His expression was still serious, a slight frown creasing his forehead. He seemed to weigh his words carefully before speaking. "I called the number on your prescription," Henry said, "just to verify." No one answered. Charles stared at him, surprised. You called? Without even asking me first? Henry shrugged. It's protocol. We need to be sure. Charles took a deep breath, fighting to keep his frustration in check. I've been getting this prescription filled here for months. Why are you treating me like I'm doing something wrong? Henry didn't look away. Like I mentioned earlier, we've been getting a lot of fake prescriptions lately. I'm just trying to do my job. Charles could feel the anger rising. He wasn't sure if it was Henry's tone, the way he said people, like it meant something more, or the fact that everyone in the store seemed to be listening in, pretending not to hear, but clearly paying attention. It felt like he was being singled out, targeted. You're just doing your job, huh? Charles said, his voice tight. And what exactly about my prescription makes you think it's fake? Henry hesitated for a moment, then looked at Charles directly. It's not just about your prescription. We're on high alert right now. New guidelines from the management. We have to be cautious. Charles shook his head. Cautious? Or just suspicious? Because it feels like you're suspicious of me for no reason. Henry's eyes hardened a bit. Sir, if you have nothing to hide, there shouldn't be a problem with me checking. I'm just following procedure. If you'd like to take your business elsewhere, you're free to do so. Charles felt his hands clench into fists. He looked around the pharmacy, noticing the way people were avoiding his gaze, pretending to be absorbed in their shopping. He felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. He wasn't doing anything wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal. I don't see you questioning anyone else, Charles said quietly, leaning closer to the counter. Why me? What's different about me? Henry's face remained impassive, but there was a slight flush to his cheeks. I treat all customers the same, he said. I'm just being thorough. Charles gave a bitter laugh. Thorough? Is that what you call this? I call it profiling. I call it you looking at me and making assumptions. Henry's jaw tightened. I don't appreciate being accused of that. Like I said, I'm just doing my job. Charles felt a surge of anger, the injustice of the situation hitting him hard. He didn't deserve this treatment. He didn't deserve to be made to feel like he was doing something wrong just for getting his medication. Fine, Charles said sharply. Go ahead. Check all you want. Call my doctor. Run my ID. Do whatever you need to do. But know this. You're only doing this because of the way I look, and that's on you, not on me. Henry's expression flickered, just for a moment, before settling back into a professional mask. He picked up the phone again, dialing a number and turning slightly away from Charles as he spoke quietly into the receiver. Charles stood there, fuming, his heart pounding in his chest. The feeling of being judged, of being suspected for no other reason than the color of his skin, was like a weight pressing down on him. He felt the frustration boiling up, but he kept it under control. Losing his temper wouldn't help. He knew that, but staying calm was becoming harder with each passing second. Charles watched Henry finish his phone call, set down the phone, and returned to the counter. Henry's face was set in a neutral expression, but Charles could see the tension in his eyes, the discomfort at being challenged. I've made a note to follow up with your doctor, Henry said. Until then, I'm afraid I can't fill this prescription. Charles felt the last bit of his patience snap. You can't fill it because you don't want to, he said coldly. This isn't about safety or protocol. This is about your bias, plain and simple. Henry opened his mouth to respond, but Charles didn't give him a chance. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his footsteps heavy on the tile floor. He could feel everyone's eyes on him, the silent spectators to his humiliation. The bell above the door chimed again, and Charles pushed it open, stepping back into the heat of the afternoon. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm inside him. He wasn't going to let this slide, not this time. Charles pulled out his phone, searching for the contact details of the pharmacy's owner. He wasn't going to let Henry's behavior go unchecked. Someone needed to know what was happening here. Someone needed to take responsibility. As he dialed the number, Charles made a silent promise to himself. He would stand up for himself, not just for his sake, but for anyone else who might face the same treatment. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Charles stood outside the pharmacy, staring at his phone. His thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating for a moment before pressing it. The phone rang twice before a voice answered, bright and businesslike. Good afternoon, Main Street Pharmacy. This is Sandra. How can I help you? Charles took a deep breath, steadying his voice. Hi, Sandra. I need to speak to Eleanor White, the owner. It's important. There was a pause, and then Sandra's voice softened slightly. I'm sorry, she's not in today. Can I take a message? Charles's frustration flared again. He needed to speak to someone now. He needed to do something to channel the anger boiling inside him. Please let her know that Charles Johnson called. I've been a customer for years, and there's an issue with one of her employees that I need to discuss. It's urgent. Sandra hesitated. Of course, Mr. Johnson. I'll make sure she gets the message. Is there anything else I can do for you? No, that's all, Charles said curtly, ending the call. He stood there for a moment, the heat of the afternoon sun beating down on him. He felt like he was about to explode, the anger and humiliation from inside the pharmacy still fresh in his mind. He glanced back at the entrance, his reflection caught in the glass door. He could see Henry behind the counter, speaking to another customer now, his demeanor calm and professional, as if nothing had happened. Charles's fists clenched at his sides. This was not going to end here. With renewed resolve, Charles pushed the door open again and strode back into the pharmacy. The bell chimed and heads turned. Charles ignored them, heading straight for the counter. Henry looked up, his expression unreadable as Charles approached. Mr. Johnson, Henry said, keeping his voice level. I've already told you. No, Charles cut him off, his voice sharp. You don't get to brush me off like that. I'm not leaving until you explain why you're treating me this way. Henry's face remained calm, but Charles could see the annoyance flicker in his eyes. I've explained, sir. We have procedures to follow. If you're not satisfied, you can come back after I've verified your prescription. Charles's voice rose, his anger bubbling over. Procedures? Don't give me that. This isn't about procedures. This is about you looking at me and deciding I'm suspicious because I don't look like your other customers. Admit it. The other customers in the store were watching now, their eyes darting between Charles and Henry. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting on their feet or pretending to browse the shelves. Others were openly staring, curious about the confrontation. Henry's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed even. Sir, please lower your voice. There's no need to cause a scene. A scene? Charles said, his voice still loud. You're the one causing a scene by refusing to fill my prescription for no good reason. You're making me feel like a criminal right here in front of everyone. Henry's face flushed slightly. He glanced around at the customers, then back at Charles. I've done nothing wrong. I'm following protocol. If you have a complaint, you can take it up with the management. Charles felt a surge of indignation. You're hiding behind protocol because you don't want to admit what this is really about. You think you can treat people differently based on how they look, and no one will call you out on it. Henry's expression turned cold. Sir, I suggest you leave the premises now before I call security. Charles's heart pounded in his chest. Go ahead. Call security. I'm not the one causing trouble. You are. Henry reached for the phone behind the counter, picking up the receiver. Officer Delgado, we need you at the pharmacy counter, he said into the intercom, his voice steady. Charles stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. A few moments later, Officer Delgado appeared, his expression serious but calm. He assessed the situation quickly, looking between Charles and Henry. Is there a problem here? Delgado asked, his voice firm but not aggressive. Charles turned to Delgado, gesturing toward Henry. Yeah, there's a problem. I'm being refused service for no reason other than this man's bias. He thinks my prescription is fake, but he has no evidence, just his assumptions. Delgado looked at Henry. Henry, what's going on? Henry folded his arms across his chest. We've had issues with fake prescriptions. I'm just doing my job, following up. Mr. Johnson here is making a scene because I asked him to wait while I verify his prescription. Charles couldn't hold back his anger any longer. This isn't about fake prescriptions. This is about the fact that you looked at me and decided I was suspicious because of my skin color. You don't treat other customers this way. Delgado held up his hands. All right, let's all take a breath. Mr. Johnson, why don't we step outside and talk? Charles shook his head. No, I'm not going anywhere. I'm tired of being treated like this. I came here to get my medication, and I'm being harassed because of who I am. It's not right, and I won't stand for it. Delgado looked at Henry, then back at Charles. Mr. Johnson, I understand you're upset, but let's try to resolve this peacefully. Charles's voice was firm. There's nothing to resolve. I'm not doing anything wrong. All I want is to be treated like any other customer. Is that too much to ask? Delgado nodded slowly. You're right. You deserve to be treated fairly. Let's see if we can sort this out without any more confrontation. Charles took a deep breath, his anger still simmering but under control. Fine, but I'm not leaving until I get some answers. Delgado turned to Henry. Henry, is there a way to resolve this without escalating things further? Henry hesitated, his face still hard. I still need to verify the prescription. That's all I'm asking. Charles shook his head. And how long is that going to take? How long do I have to wait to be treated like a normal person? Henry didn't answer. He turned away, busying himself with the computer. Charles stood there, feeling the tension in the air. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. But he also knew he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. As Charles stood his ground, the eyes of the other customers bore into him, silent witnesses to the injustice playing out in front of them. He felt a surge of determination. This might be Henry's pharmacy, but it was Charles's dignity on the line, and he wasn't about to let it be trampled on. Charles stood his ground at the pharmacy counter, his arms crossed over his chest, refusing to move. The tension was palpable, a heavy cloud hanging over the store. The other customers had stepped back, watching the confrontation unfold, whispering to one another. The atmosphere was thick with discomfort, but Charles didn't care. He wasn't about to be treated like a criminal without standing up for himself. Officer Delgado remained between Charles and Henry, trying to defuse the situation. His voice was calm, but Charles could see the concern in his eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I understand you are upset. Let's just take a moment to calm down and figure this out. No need to make this harder than it has to be." Charles shook his head, his voice steady. "I'm calm, officer. I'm not the one escalating this. I just want to know why I'm being treated differently. Why is my prescription being questioned when no one else's is?" Henry, still standing behind the counter, looked at Charles with a mix of irritation and defensiveness. "Mr. Johnson, as I've said, we've been having issues with fake prescriptions. This is nothing personal. It's just about following protocol." Charles's frustration flared. "Nothing personal? It sure feels personal to me. You don't question other customers like this. I've seen you help dozens of people without so much as a second glance. Why am I different?" Henry's face flushed slightly. "I treat all my customers the same," he said firmly. "I'm just being cautious. If you can't understand that, then maybe you should find another pharmacy." Charles felt a wave of humiliation wash over him. His voice rose, louder now, carrying through the store. "You're not cautious. You're prejudiced. You're treating me like a suspect because of the way I look, and everyone here can see it." The murmurs among the other customers grew louder. Some people shook their heads, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of them. Others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. The feeling of being put on display, of having his character questioned in front of strangers, made Charles's skin prickle with anger. Officer Delgado stepped in, his voice firmer this time. "Let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be. Henry, can you verify the prescription and let Mr. Johnson go on his way?" Henry's lips pressed into a thin line. "Already tried. No one answered at the doctor's office. Until I can confirm, I can't fill the prescription. It's as simple as that." Charles's patience snapped. "And how long is that going to take? An hour? A day? How long am I supposed to wait for you to decide I'm telling the truth?" Henry shrugged. "As long as it takes." Charles felt his fists clench. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, anger coursing through his veins. He took a step closer to the counter, his voice low and firm. "You know what this is about, Henry. You know this isn't just about the prescription. You don't trust me because of the color of my skin. Admit it." Henry's eyes flashed, and for a moment Charles thought he saw a flicker of guilt. But then Henry's expression hardened. "I'm not admitting anything. I'm doing my job. If you don't like it, you can leave." Charles opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Officer Delgado gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Johnson, let's step outside and talk. We can sort this out, but yelling in the middle of the store isn't going to help." Charles pulled back, shaking his head. "No, I'm not going anywhere until this is resolved. I have a right to be here, just like anyone else." Delgado's voice was low, almost pleading. "I understand, but we need to keep the peace. Let's take a minute to calm down, please." Charles looked around, taking in the faces of the customers watching him. He could see a mix of emotions: sympathy, curiosity, discomfort. He felt like every eye in the room was judging him, weighing his actions. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the anger wouldn't go away. "Fine," Charles said finally, his voice trembling with frustration. "I'll go outside, but this isn't over. I'm not letting this go." Delgado nodded, stepping back to allow Charles to walk ahead of him. Charles turned, heading for the door, his footsteps heavy against the tile floor. As he reached the exit, he glanced back at Henry. The pharmacist was already turning away, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The bell above the door chimed as Charles stepped out into the sunlight. The heat hit him immediately, but it did little to ease the fire burning inside him. Officer Delgado followed him out, closing the door behind them. "Look, Mr. Johnson," Delgado said, his voice low. "I know this isn't fair, but I'm asking you to let us handle this calmly. You've made your point. Let me talk to Henry, see if we can get this sorted out." Charles turned to face Delgado, his expression set. "I'm tired of being told to calm down. I'm tired of being treated like I'm in the wrong when I'm not. All I want is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. Is that too much to ask? Delgado sighed. No, it's not, and I'll do what I can to help. Just give me a chance to talk to Henry. Maybe we can find a way to resolve this without it getting more heated. Charles nodded, though his anger still simmered just beneath the surface. Fine, talk to him. But if he won't change his mind, I'm taking this to the owner. Someone has to be held accountable. Delgado placed a hand on Charles's shoulder, offering a small nod of understanding. I'll do what I can. Just hang tight, okay? Charles watched as Delgado turned and went back inside the pharmacy. The door closed behind him, leaving Charles alone on the sidewalk, staring at the reflection of the store's sign in the glass window. His heart was still pounding, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. He couldn't believe that in this day and age, he was still facing this kind of treatment. He had done nothing wrong, but here he was, being treated like a criminal because of a prejudice that had nothing to do with him. Charles knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this go. Not this time. He pulled out his phone again, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. He tapped the call button, raising the phone to his ear. Hi, is this Dr. Patel's office? Charles said when the call connected. I need to speak to someone about my prescription. It's urgent. As he waited for the receptionist to transfer his call, Charles stared at the pharmacy's door. He wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. Charles walked away from the pharmacy, his heart still racing with anger. The conversation with Officer Delgado had only settled him momentarily. As soon as the officer had disappeared back into the store, the feelings of frustration and humiliation surged back, stronger than ever. He needed to calm down, but more than that, he needed to do something. He couldn't let this experience become another silent moment of injustice. He found a bench a few feet away from the pharmacy's entrance and sat down, taking out his phone. He had to think carefully. Calling Dr. Patel's office directly had been the right move, but he needed more than just validation from his doctor. He needed someone with authority over Henry, someone who could make a real difference. He needed to speak with Eleanor White, the owner of the pharmacy. Charles tapped on his phone's screen, searching for the pharmacy's business listing. It wasn't hard to find. The store had been a staple in the community for years. It was the kind of place people recommended for its friendly service and knowledgeable staff. The irony wasn't lost on him. He dialed the number and waited, the ringing on the other end only heightening his sense of urgency. After a few rings, Sandra's familiar voice answered. Main Street Pharmacy. This is Sandra speaking. How can I help you? Sandra, it's Charles Johnson again, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I need to speak to Eleanor White. It's about an incident that happened with one of her employees, Henry. There was a pause. Charles could almost hear Sandra weighing her response. I'm sorry, Mr. Johnson, but Mrs. White isn't available today. Can I take a message? I promise she'll get it first thing. Charles clenched his jaw, trying to keep his frustration in check. No, Sandra, this can't wait. I need to speak with her as soon as possible. It's urgent. I'm being treated unfairly, and I need her to know about it. Sandra's voice softened. I understand you're upset, Mr. Johnson. I'll try to reach her and let her know it's important. Can I have your number just in case? Charles rattled off his phone number, his fingers tapping restlessly on his knee as he waited. He could hear Sandra scribbling something down on the other end of the line. I'll pass this along to Mrs. White right away, Sandra said finally. She's always very responsive. I'm sure she'll get back to you soon. Thank you, Charles said, his voice tight. He ended the call and sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. He knew Sandra was only doing her job, but it didn't ease the knot of tension in his chest. Charles looked back at the pharmacy, the anger from earlier still simmering. He had no intention of waiting passively. He stood up from the bench and began walking, heading toward the office building just a block away. Dr. Patel's office was located on the second floor, and Charles knew the doctor would still be there. He was usually in until late afternoon seeing patients. As Charles entered the building, the receptionist at the front desk looked up with a smile. Hi, Charles, she said warmly. Everything all right? He nodded, though his expression was serious. I need to see Dr. Patel. Is he with a patient? She glanced at the schedule on her screen. He's just finishing up with someone, but I can let him know you're here. Is it an emergency? Charles thought about his answer. Sort of. It's about my prescription. Something came up at the pharmacy. She nodded, picking up the phone to page the doctor. Charles sat down in the waiting area, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew Dr. Patel well enough. They had developed a rapport over the past year, and Charles trusted him. He knew Dr. Patel would help. After a few minutes, Dr. Patel emerged from the hallway, his kind eyes crinkling with concern. He was a middle-aged man with a gentle demeanor, always taking the time to listen to his patients. Charles, Dr. Patel said, extending a hand. What's going on? Is everything all right? Charles shook his hand, grateful for the familiar presence. I don't know, Doc. I went to pick up my prescription, and Henry, the pharmacist, refused to fill it. He said he needed to verify it first and called you, but no one answered. Dr. Patel's brow furrowed. That's strange. I haven't received any calls from the pharmacy today, and your prescription is valid as always. I don't understand why there'd be an issue. Charles's frustration spilled over. It's not just about the prescription, to Patel. Henry was treating me like I was doing something wrong, like he assumed it was fake just because I was the one handing it in. It feels like he was profiling me. Patel's expression darkened. Profiling? Charles, that's serious. I've never known Henry to act that way, but if that's what's happening, it needs to be addressed. I'll call the pharmacy myself right now. We'll get this sorted out. Charles nodded, feeling a small measure of relief. Thanks, Doc. I just want to be treated fairly. I'm not causing trouble. I just want my medication. Dr. Patel placed a reassuring hand on Charles's shoulder. I understand. Give me a moment. He turned and walked back to his office, leaving Charles to wait. Charles could hear the faint sound of Dr. Patel's voice through the office door, but he couldn't make out the words. A few minutes later, Dr. Patel returned, his expression serious but calm. I spoke with Henry. He acknowledged the issue and said he'd verify your prescription. I made it clear that there was no reason to doubt it in the first place. I'll follow up with Eleanor White myself. This kind of treatment isn't acceptable, Charles. Charles nodded, grateful for Dr. Patel's support. Thank you. I've already tried to reach Eleanor, but I haven't heard back yet. Dr. Patel smiled faintly. Don't worry. I'll make sure she knows this is serious. In the meantime, if you need anything else, just let me know. Charles shook Dr. Patel's hand again. I appreciate it. Really, I'm just trying to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. As Charles left Dr. Patel's office, he felt a renewed sense of determination. He had taken the right steps. He had spoken up, sought help, and wasn't going to let this slide. As he walked back to the pharmacy, his mind was clear. He would wait for Eleanor's response, but he knew he had the support of Dr. Patel. Whatever happened next, Charles was ready to face it. He was done being silent. He was done letting things slide. Today was the day things would start to change. Charles returned home from Dr. Patel's office with a lingering sense of anger, but also a newfound determination. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stepped through his front door. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. Unknown number. Charles took a deep breath before answering, hoping it was the call he had been waiting for. Hello? Mr. Johnson, this is Eleanor White, the owner of Main Street Pharmacy, a woman's voice said. Her tone was calm, with a hint of concern. I received your message and spoke briefly with Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel, I understand there's been an issue with one of my employees. I'd like to hear about it directly from you. Charles felt a wave of relief mixed with tension. He had prepared for this moment, but the reality of it made his throat tighten. Thank you for calling, Ms. White. I really appreciate it. I can come by your office to explain everything. That would be great, Eleanor said. Can you come in now? I'm at the pharmacy, and I'd like to handle this personally. Sure, I'll be there in about 10 minutes, Charles said. Thank you for taking the time. Eleanor's voice was steady. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'll see you soon. Charles hung up the phone and grabbed his car keys. He took another deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was his chance to speak up, to make sure Henry's behavior was addressed. He knew he had to approach this calmly and clearly, even if his emotions were still raw. The drive back to the pharmacy was short, but Charles's mind raced the entire time. He replayed the events of the day, thinking about everything he would say. By the time he parked in front of the pharmacy, he had his thoughts organized. He wasn't going to be sidetracked by excuses or defensive responses. He wanted justice and he wanted change. Charles walked through the pharmacy's doors. The familiar chime of the bells sounded above him. The store was quieter now, with only a few customers browsing the aisles. He spotted Eleanor White standing near the back, talking to Sandra, the receptionist. Eleanor was a tall woman with short silver hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She turned as Charles approached, her eyes meeting his. Mr. Johnson, Oklahoma? Eleanor asked, extending a hand. Yes, that's me, Charles replied, shaking her hand firmly. Thank you for meeting with me. Eleanor nodded, her expression serious. Please, call me Eleanor. Let's go to my office where we can talk privately. Charles followed her to a small office at the back of the pharmacy. The room was neat, with a desk, a computer, and shelves lined with files and pharmacy manuals. Eleanor gestured for Charles to sit in one of the chairs across from her desk. Please, have a seat, she said, taking her own chair behind the desk. I've heard a bit from Dr. Patel, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what happened today. Charles took a deep breath, sitting down and meeting Eleanor's eyes. Thank you, Eleanor. I came here to fill my prescription like I do every month. But today, Henry treated me like a criminal. He questioned my prescription, acted like it was fake, and refused to fill it without any real reason. He said it was just about protocol. But I've been here many times before, and he's never done that. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes focused on Charles. What exactly did Henry say to you? Can you tell me more about how he handled the situation? Charles nodded. He started asking where I got the prescription and said he needed to verify it. I told him it was from Dr. Patel, like usual, but he kept questioning me. It wasn't just the questions, it was the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, like he had already decided I was lying. Eleanor's expression remained calm, but Charles could see a flicker of concern in her eyes. Did Henry give any specific reason for not filling the prescription? No, Charles said firmly. He just kept talking about fake prescriptions and how he had to be cautious. But I could tell it was about more than that. I felt like he was profiling me because of the way I look. When I challenged him on it, he called security. I was humiliated in front of everyone. Eleanor sighed softly, leaning back in her chair. I'm very sorry to hear this, Mr. Johnson. This is not how we run our business. I take these matters very seriously. Our goal is to provide a safe and respectful environment for all our customers. I want you to know that I will look into this personally. Charles appreciated her words, but he wasn't ready to let go of his frustration just yet. I've been coming here for years, Eleanor. I've always felt comfortable here. Today, that changed. I don't want to believe that one employee's actions represent this entire pharmacy, but something has to be done. This can't happen again, not to me or anyone else. Eleanor nodded. You're absolutely right. I'll be reviewing the security footage from today and having a direct conversation with Henry about his behavior. If there's evidence of any misconduct or bias, appropriate action will be taken. I can assure you of that. Charles felt a bit of the tension ease from his shoulders. Thank you. I just want to make sure people are treated fairly. I'm not trying to cause trouble, I just want respect. Eleanor leaned forward, her expression sincere. And you deserve that respect, Mr. Johnson, we all do. I appreciate you coming to me with this. It's the only way we can address these issues and make our community better. I'll be in touch with you soon to let you know how we're handling this. In the meantime, please feel free to continue filling your prescriptions here. I'll make sure this incident doesn't affect your future visits. Charles nodded, feeling a sense of relief. Thank you, Eleanor. I'm glad we could talk. I'll wait to hear from you. He stood up and Eleanor did the same, walking him to the door. As they reached the entrance to the office, she paused, looking at him with a thoughtful expression. Mr. Johnson, Eleanor said, I want you to know that what you've done today is important. Speaking up isn't always easy, but it's necessary. I'll do everything I can to make sure this is handled properly. Charles appreciated her words, feeling a sense of validation. Thank you. That means a lot. He left the office, making his way through the pharmacy toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the afternoon sun warming his face, Charles felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had taken a stand. He had spoken out against injustice. Now it was up to Eleanor to make sure the right thing was done. Charles knew this wasn't the end, but it was a start, a step toward ensuring that no one else would have to face what he did. As he walked back to his car, his thoughts were clearer. He had a voice, and he had used it, and he would continue to use it as long as there were wrongs to be righted. The following day, Eleanor White arrived at the pharmacy early. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the windows, casting long shadows across the store floor. Eleanor felt a sense of purpose as she walked to her office, her heels clicking softly against the tile. She knew she had to handle the situation with Charles Johnson carefully and fairly. It wasn't just about one incident, it was about the reputation of her pharmacy and the values she stood for. Eleanor closed the office door behind her and sat down at her desk. She had spent most of the previous night thinking about what Charles had said. The sincerity and frustration in his voice had been unmistakable. She needed to get to the bottom of this, and she needed to do it quickly. She turned on her computer and accessed the security footage from the day before. The camera positioned above the pharmacy counter had a clear view of Charles and Henry's interaction. Eleanor fast-forwarded until she saw Charles approaching the counter, then hit play. She watched closely, paying attention to their body language, their expressions, and the tension that had built up between them. The footage showed Charles handing over his prescription, a polite smile on his face. Henry's response was immediate. His demeanor shifted from routine to suspicion in a matter of seconds. Eleanor saw the way Henry scrutinized the prescription slip, how his eyes narrowed as he looked at Charles. She watched the exchange, Charles's calm demeanor growing more strained as Henry questioned him. She could see Charles's shoulders stiffen, the frustration building with each question Henry asked. Eleanor's stomach tightened as she continued watching. Henry's actions were not just about protocol. There was a clear difference in how he treated Charles compared to other customers she had seen in past footage. The call to security was the final straw. She saw Charles's face flush with anger and humiliation as Officer Delgado appeared. Charles's posture, initially confident and calm, shifted to defensive and angry. Eleanor paused the video, her hands resting on the keyboard. She had seen enough. Charles's concerns were valid. Henry's behavior had crossed the line from cautious to prejudiced. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. Henry had worked at the pharmacy for years, and she had always trusted him to treat customers with respect. But what she saw in the footage could not be ignored. Eleanor picked up the phone on her desk and dialed Henry's extension. He answered on the second ring. "Henry, this is Eleanor. Can you come to my office, please? We need to talk." Henry's voice was calm, almost indifferent. "Sure, I'll be right there." A few moments later, Henry knocked on the door and Eleanor called him in. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was neutral, but Eleanor could see a hint of defensiveness in his eyes. He knew this conversation was about what had happened yesterday. "Have a seat, Henry," Eleanor said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Henry sat down, his posture stiff. Eleanor looked at him for a moment, trying to gauge his reaction before she spoke. "I reviewed the security footage from yesterday," Eleanor began. "I saw the interaction between you and Charles Johnson. I have to say, Henry, I'm concerned about what I saw." Henry's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Eleanor continued, "Charles felt that he was being treated unfairly, that he was singled out because of his race. From what I observed in the footage, it seems that your questioning of his prescription went beyond normal protocol. It looked like you were making assumptions about him that were not based on any evidence." Henry shifted in his seat. "I was just following procedure, Eleanor. We've had issues with fake prescriptions before. I was being cautious. You can't be too careful these days." Eleanor nodded slowly, but her eyes remained fixed on Henry. "I understand the need for caution, Henry, but there's a difference between being cautious and being discriminatory. Charles has been a loyal customer for years. There was no reason to doubt the legitimacy of his prescription based on what I saw." Henry's face reddened slightly. "He started getting angry, Eleanor. I had to call security. I was just trying to keep things from getting out of hand." Eleanor's voice remained calm. "Charles got angry because he felt he was being treated unfairly. I can see how he would feel that way. You are questioning the way you looked at him. It wasn't just about procedure. It was about an assumption you made based on his appearance." Henry's eyes flickered with frustration. "So what? I'm supposed to ignore protocol because someone might get offended? I was doing my job." Eleanor leaned forward, her voice firm. "Your job is to treat all our customers with respect, Henry. Your job is to follow protocol without letting personal biases influence your behavior. What happened yesterday was unacceptable, and it can't happen again." Henry's mouth tightened into a thin line. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that we have a responsibility to our customers and our community," Eleanor said. "I'm saying that as of today, your employment here is terminated. We cannot tolerate discriminatory behavior, intentional or not." Henry's face flushed with anger. "You're firing me? Over one incident? After all the years I've worked here?" Eleanor's voice was steady. "It's not just one incident, Henry. It's about the trust that our customers place in us, in the integrity of our business. I cannot allow this pharmacy to become a place where customers feel judged or disrespected. This is not an easy decision, but it's the right one." Henry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine. If that's how you feel, I'll leave. But you're making a mistake, Eleanor. You're choosing to believe him over your own staff." Eleanor stood as well, maintaining her composure. "I'm choosing to believe what I saw and to uphold the values that this pharmacy stands for. I'm sorry it has to end this way, Henry." Without another word, Henry turned and walked out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Eleanor sat back down, exhaling slowly. The decision to fire Henry had not been easy, but watching the footage and seeing Charles's face had made the path clear. She knew she had done the right thing, even if it meant letting go of a longtime employee. Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed Charles's number. After a few rings, he answered. "Mr. Johnson, this is Eleanor White," she said. "I wanted to let you know that I've reviewed the footage and had a discussion with Henry. I've made the decision to terminate his employment effective immediately." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Charles spoke. "Thank you, Eleanor. I appreciate you taking this seriously. You were right to bring this to my attention, Eleanor said. I'm truly sorry for the way you were treated. This is not what our pharmacy stands for, and I will make sure it doesn't happen again. If there's anything else I can do to make this right, please let me know. Charles's voice was calm. Just knowing that steps are being taken is enough. I hope this means others won't have to go through the same thing. Eleanor nodded, even though he couldn't see her. That's my goal. Thank you, Charles, for speaking up. If you need anything in the future, please don't hesitate to reach out. After the call ended, Eleanor sat back, feeling the weight of the morning's events. She knew she had done what was necessary to protect the integrity of her business and the trust of her customers. But more than that, she knew that standing up against discrimination was the only way to ensure that her pharmacy remained a place of fairness and respect. Eleanor looked out the window, watching the sun rise higher in the sky. She felt a sense of resolve. Today had been difficult, but it was a necessary step toward making things right, and she was ready to take that step, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Charles stood in his living room, phone still in hand, processing Eleanor's words. She had done it. She had fired Henry. A wave of emotions washed over him. Relief, validation, and a quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. He set his phone down on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath. It wasn't just about the outcome. It was about knowing that he had been heard, that his experience mattered. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt the weight of injustice begin to lift from his shoulders. Later that afternoon, Charles decided to visit the pharmacy. He wanted to see for himself how things would be different. There was still a trace of nervousness inside him, the memory of the confrontation with Henry lingering. But he knew that Eleanor had taken the right steps. It was time to see if those steps made a difference. As he walked through the pharmacy's door, the familiar chime greeted him. The store was busy, with customers moving up and down the aisles. Charles glanced over at the pharmacy counter. Sandra, the receptionist, was busy helping a customer, but when she noticed Charles, she smiled warmly. Mr. Johnson, it's good to see you, Sandra said, her tone friendly. How are you today? Charles nodded, appreciating the welcome. I'm doing all right, Sandra. Just came to pick up my prescription. Sandra motioned for him to wait for a moment. I'll let the pharmacist know you're here. Thank you for coming back. Charles watched as Sandra walked over to the new pharmacist, a young woman he hadn't seen before. She introduced Charles to the pharmacist, who nodded and smiled before preparing his medication. Charles waited near the counter, observing the interactions around him. There was a different energy in the air, a sense of normalcy returning. A few minutes later, the pharmacist approached with Charles's prescription in hand. Hi, Mr. Johnson, she said, offering a friendly smile. I'm Emily, the new pharmacist. I've got your prescription ready for you. If you have any questions about your medication, just let me know. Charles took the prescription, nodding. Thank you, Emily. I appreciate it. Emily's demeanor was professional and kind, and Charles felt the unease from his previous visits fading away. It felt good to be treated like any other customer, without suspicion or unnecessary questioning. He knew this was what he had been fighting for, not just for himself, but for everyone who walked through those doors. As he was about to leave, Eleanor emerged from her office. She caught sight of Charles and walked over, her expression sincere. Mr. Johnson, I'm glad to see you, Eleanor said, extending her hand. Thank you for coming back. I wanted to make sure everything was all right and that you were being taken care of. Charles shook her hand, appreciating the gesture. Thank you, Eleanor. I can see you've made some change. It means a lot. Eleanor nodded. We have, and we're committed to maintaining that. I want this pharmacy to be a place where everyone feels safe and respected. If there's anything more we can do, please let me know. Charles glanced around the pharmacy, feeling a sense of calm. This is good. I appreciate you taking my concerns seriously. It's not just about me, it's about making sure no one else goes through what I did. Eleanor's eyes softened. You did the right thing by speaking up. It's how we make progress, even when it's uncomfortable. Your voice matters, and we're listening. Charles smiled, a genuine sense of relief washing over him. Thank you, Eleanor. I'm glad to know that. As Charles left the pharmacy, he felt lighter. He walked down the street, the sun warm on his face. His steps were more assured, the tension he had carried for days finally easing. He knew that his actions had made a difference, not just for him, but for the community. Later that evening, Charles sat on his porch, watching the sunset. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, a peaceful end to a long, tumultuous journey. He thought about the events of the past few days, his confrontation with Henry, the meeting with Eleanor, and the decision she had made. It all felt like a turning point, a moment when standing up for what was right had truly mattered. Charles's phone buzzed beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Dr. Patel. Dr. Patel, just heard about the outcome. Proud of you for standing up for yourself. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to call. Charles smiled, typing back a quick response. Charles, thanks, Doc. I appreciate your support. Means a lot. He set the phone down, feeling a sense of connection to those who had stood by him. The fight wasn't over. He knew there would always be challenges and moments where he'd have to speak up. But now Charles knew he had allies. He had a voice, and he wasn't afraid to use it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Charles felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would continue to advocate for fairness and respect, both for himself and for others. He understood now that change wasn't always immediate, but every step forward mattered. Every voice raised against injustice was a step toward a better, more just world. Charles watched the last light of day fade into night, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. He felt at peace, knowing that today he had made a difference, and tomorrow he would continue to do the same.